Your mind is talking to you right now. Not in the way I mean when I say that, not the conscious, deliberate, purposeful thinking you choose to engage in, the other kind, the background kind, the voice that has been running largely uninterrupted since you woke up. This morning, since you woke up, in fact, on most mornings you can remember, the one that rehearses conversations that have already happened and prepares for conversations that may never happen, the one that takes a passing worry and turns it, with quiet and terrible efficiency, into an architecture of catastrophe, the one that asks the same question for the 100th time and receives, for the 100th time, an answer that satisfies it for approximately 4 minutes before the question reassembles and begins again. You know this voice intimately. You have lived with it your entire life, and if you are honest, more honest than most people allow themselves to be about the quality of their own inner experience, it has cost you something, not just the obvious things, the sleep, the focus, the hours spent in imaginary arguments with people who were not in the room, something deeper than that, the quiet, the spaciousness, the sense of being present in your own life rather than perpetually rehearsing it, analyzing it, auditing it from a small and relentless distance. This audiobook is a philosophical and psychological inquiry into that voice, not a guide to silencing it, which does not work and which we will discuss at some length, but an honest investigation of what it is, where it comes from, what it believes it is doing, and what a genuinely different relationship with it might look like, one built not on resistance but on understanding, not on control but on something that philosophy and contemplative practice and the best of modern neuroscience have arrived at by different roads together. The noise inside is not your enemy, it is your most misunderstood companion. And what part 1? The philosophical question behind all overthinking. If you trace any sustained loop of overthinking back far enough, if you follow the thread of any persistent worry or obsessive revisitation past the surface content of what is being worried about, you will almost invariably arrive at the same destination, a question about control. Specifically, the question of whether the future can be made safe through sufficient thought applied in the present. This is the philosophical engine underneath the overthinking mind, the belief, rarely examined, deeply held, running as an unquestioned assumption beneath the surface of the loop, that if you think about this enough, carefully enough, thoroughly enough, from enough angles, accounting for enough contingencies, you will arrive at a thought that resolves the uncertainty, that produces the guarantee, that makes the future finally safe to approach. And the reason the loop never ends, the reason the thinking never delivers the relief it promises, is that this belief is wrong, not wrong in a way that more careful thinking can correct, wrong at a foundational level, because the future is not a problem that can be solved by thought, it is a territory that can only be entered, and no amount of mental rehearsal, however thorough and however sophisticated, constitutes the entering. The Stoics understood this with extraordinary clarity. Epictetus, who was born a slave, whose first direct experience of the world was the absolute and documented absence of control over his own circumstances, built an entire philosophy around the single distinction that the overthinking mind perpetually refuses to make, the distinction between what is within our power and what is not, what he called the dichotomy of control. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our responses, these are within our power. Everything else, the outcomes, the responses of other people, the weather of circumstance, the thousand variables that determine how any given situation actually unfolds, these are not, and the entirety of human suffering, in Epictetus's framework, arises from the confusion of these two categories, from treating what is not in our power as if it were, From applying the energy of control to the territory of the uncontrollable and being perpetually, exhaustingly, inevitably defeated. Overthinking is the mind's attempt to control what cannot be controlled using the only tool it has. It is not stupidity, it is not weakness, it is a brave and futile attempt to think its way to safety in a world that does not offer safety as a permanent condition. The Buddhist tradition arrives at a similar place from a different direction. The concept of dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more precisely rendered as unsatisfactoriness, the pervasive sense of incompleteness and unease that characterizes ordinary human experience, is described in Buddhist philosophy as arising fundamentally from tanha, craving, the specific craving that underlies the overthinking mind, is the craving for permanence in a world that offers only impermanence, the desire for certainty in a reality constituted by uncertainty, the attempt to fix, to secure, to nail down what is by its nature fluid and ungraspable. Neither the Stoic nor the Buddhist answer to this is resignation. Neither recommends indifference or passivity in the face of genuine problems that genuine action can address. What both recommend is discrimination, the careful, practiced ability to distinguish between the problems that thinking can solve and the uncertainty that thinking cannot resolve, only accept, and to bring the full force of the mind to the former while releasing the latter, not as defeat, but as wisdom. The overthinking mind cannot make this distinction automatically. It has been trained by years of anxious repetition to treat all uncertainty as a problem awaiting a solution. Retraining it begins with the question that almost no one in the middle of a loop stops to ask: is this a problem I can solve with more thinking, or is this an uncertainty I am trying to think my way out of? The answer to that question, held honestly, changes everything about how you respond. Part 2. The neuroscience of a mind that loops. Philosophy tells us what the overthinking mind is trying to do. Neuroscience tells us how it does it. The specific neural machinery of rumination, of worry, of the loop that runs and runs without ever arriving at its destination. And understanding this machinery does something important: it removes the shame. The brain has a network, identified and named in the early 2000s by neuroscientist Marcus Rachel, called the default mode network. It is the network that activates when the brain is not engaged in focused external tasks, when attention is not directed outward at a specific problem or stimulus. The default mode network comes online, and it does something that, from an evolutionary perspective, makes complete sense. It simulates. It runs mental models of the past, reviewing what happened and extracting lessons. It runs mental models of the future, anticipating what might happen and preparing responses. It constructs and maintains the narrative of the self, the continuous story of who you are and how you relate to the world around you. This is not a flaw. This is one of the most sophisticated cognitive capacities that evolution has ever produced. The ability to mentally time travel, to learn from the past without being destroyed by it, to prepare for the future without waiting to experience it, is a significant part of what has made human beings extraordinarily successful as a species. The problem is not the default mode network. The problem is what happens to it in a brain that has learned to treat uncertainty as threat. In the anxious brain, the default mode network does not simulation. It does catastrophizing. It does not review the past to extract wisdom. It revisits it to find evidence of wrongness, of failure, of the moments where something bad happened that might, with sufficient vigilance, be prevented from happening again. It does not model the future to prepare. It models it to worry, running scenario after scenario weighted toward the worst outcome. because the brain that survived was the one that took threats seriously. Neuroscientists call this ruminative thinking, the repetitive, passive focus on negative feelings and experiences without moving toward active problem-solving. Research by Susan Nolan Hoeksema at Yale showed that ruminative thinking is one of the strongest predictors of both depression and anxiety disorders, stronger in many studies than the severity of the stressful events themselves. It is not what happens to you that most determines whether you develop chronic anxiety. It is what your mind does with what happens to you in the endless hours after. There is a specific structure in the brain that plays a central role in this process, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, present in humans and in every vertebrate that has ever lived, does not distinguish between a threat that is present and a threat that is imagined. When the default mode network generates a worry scenario vivid enough to feel real, the amygdala responds to it as if the threat it depicts were actually occurring. Cortisol is released. The nervous system activates. The body prepares for a danger that exists only in the mind, and the mind, reading the body's alarm state, concludes that the danger must be real, generating more worry to account for the threat it has itself created. The loop is not a flaw in an otherwise well-functioning system. It is a system running exactly as designed, in a context it was never designed for. What this means practically is this: you cannot think your way out of the loop using the same thinking that created it. The anxious mind cannot be reasoned into stillness by the anxious mind, because every new thought it generates is produced by the same neural circuitry that is generating the anxiety. The thinking is not the solution. In most cases, it is the medium in which the problem lives. Part 3. The paradox of control. Why fighting it makes it louder. There is a psychological experiment that has been replicated many times in many forms, and that tells us something essential about the nature of the overthinking mind. The instruction is simple: for the next 5 minutes, do not think about a white bear. Whatever you do, whatever else you think about, do not allow the image of a white bear to enter your consciousness. You already know what happens. The white bear becomes the most present thing in the room, not because you are weak-willed or undisciplined, but because the very act of monitoring for the thought, the vigilance required to make sure you are not thinking it, requires holding the thought in mind as the thing to be avoided. The suppression instruction and the thought being suppressed are neurologically inseparable. The attempt to not think something is itself form of thinking it. The psychologist Daniel Wegner, who designed this experiment in the 1980s, called the phenomenon ironic process theory. His research showed that mental suppression, the attempt to prevent a specific thought from entering consciousness, paradoxically increases the frequency of that thought, particularly when the person attempting the suppression is under cognitive load, stress, or fatigue, which is to say, precisely the conditions under which most people attempt to suppress anxious thoughts are the conditions under which suppression is least likely to succeed. The harder you try not to think about what worries you, the more loudly it speaks. The more vigilantly you monitor for the thought, the more reliably it arrives. The control strategy contains, built into its structure, the mechanism of its own defeat. And yet control is the strategy that virtually everyone who overthinks brings to the problem of their overthinking. Try not to think about it, distract yourself, push it away, fill the space so completely with other things that there is no room for the worry to breathe. This is understandable. It is the natural response to something that is causing pain. When something hurts, you move away from it. The problem is that anxious thoughts are not physical objects that can be relocated. They are patterns of neural activation that become stronger, not weaker, with attempted suppression. The philosopher Alan Watts wrote about this with characteristic directness. He observed that the attempt to achieve a quiet mind by trying to quiet the mind is exactly like trying to smooth choppy water with your hand. Every intervention creates more disturbance. Every attempt to fix the agitation introduces new agitation. The water becomes still only when you stop touching it. And the mind becomes quiet only when you stop trying to make it quiet, which requires a fundamentally different relationship with what is happening in it. Acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the most empirically supported psychological approaches to anxiety and rumination, is built on a version of this insight. Its central move is what its founders call psychological flexibility, the capacity to experience thoughts and feelings, including distressing ones, without treating them as commands to be obeyed or threats to be eliminated, not the suppression of the anxious thought, not the argument with it, the simple, radical act of observing it, noticing that it is present, noting what it is saying, and declining to be entirely defined by it, the thought as weather, you as the sky. This is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is the recognition that the thinking self is not the same thing as the thought, that you can have a thought without being the thought, that the noise inside is happening in you, but it is not you, any more than the weather is the sky. Part 4. Anxiety as a philosophical problem. There is a way of understanding anxiety that goes deeper than its neurological description and reaches something that the great philosophers of the modern era identified as fundamental to the human condition itself, not anxiety as a disorder, not anxiety as a symptom to be treated. Anxiety as the inevitable experience of a being that is aware of its own existence, its own freedom and its own finitude, all at the same time. The existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote what may be the most penetrating account of anxiety ever produced in an 1844 text called The Concept of Anxiety. His central insight was that anxiety, what he called angst, dread, is not the response to a specific threat, it is the response to freedom itself, to the vertiginous awareness that you are a being who must choose constantly, inevitably, irrevocably, and that every choice simultaneously opens one path and forecloses all the others. He described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the feeling of standing at the edge of infinite possibility and being undone by it. Jean-Paul Sartre extended this insight into what he called the fundamental anxiety of human consciousness. His claim was that we are condemned to be free, that there is no escaping the burden of choice, no authority to whom we can finally and completely outsource the responsibility for who we are and what we do, and that anxiety is the emotional signature of that condition, the felt experience of radical responsibility in a universe that offers no guarantees. The overthinker is not someone who is broken. They are someone who feels the weight of this condition more acutely than most, whose sensitivity to the implications of freedom and uncertainty is turned up rather than down, whose mind returns again and again to the unresolvable questions because those questions are genuinely, philosophically unresolvable. And the mind, not knowing this, keeps trying to find the answer that philosophy would tell it does not exist. Martin Heidegger, in his monumental work Being and Time, described what he called the anxiety of being toward death, the particular quality of dread that arises when a human being genuinely confronts its own finitude, not as an intellectual proposition but as a felt reality. The awareness that the time you have is limited, that the choices you make are irreversible, that the life you are living is the only one you will have, and it is happening now, right now in the moments you are spending on everything but living it. Heidegger did not consider this anxiety pathological. He considered it clarifying. The anxiety of finitude properly encountered rather than fled from is what cuts through the noise of everyday distraction and returns us to what he called authentic existence, the life lived with full awareness of what it is and what is actually at stake in it. This reframe does not make anxiety comfortable, but it makes it meaningful. It suggests that the anxious mind is not simply malfunctioning. It is engaged at some level with the genuine difficulty of being a conscious being in a world that offers no certainty and no permanent safety, and that the path through it is not the elimination of that engagement, but its transformation. From the anxious, repetitive circling of insoluble problems to the philosophical courage of facing them directly and choosing how to live in their presence. Part 5. The only relationship with the mind that works. We have established what overthinking is trying to do and why it cannot succeed. We have looked at the neural machinery of the loop and the paradox of the control strategy that makes it worse. We have understood anxiety not as pathology but as philosophy, as the mind's honest response to conditions that genuinely warrant a response. Now we arrive at the question that everything has been building toward, not how to silence the noise, how to change your relationship with it in a way that changes everything else. The contemplative traditions, Buddhism, Stoicism, the Christian mystical tradition, the Taoist philosophy of Wu Wei, all arrive, by different roads, at a remarkably similar answer. And modern psychology, through mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and the neuroscience of attention and awareness, has arrived at it too. The answer is this: the problem is not the thoughts. The problem is the identification with the thoughts, the fusion of the thinker with the thinking, the collapse of the observer into the observed. That makes every anxious thought feel not like a passing event, but like the truth about reality. The Buddhist concept of anatta, non-self, points at something that is difficult to understand intellectually, and that becomes, when genuinely experienced even briefly, one of the most liberating recognitions available to a human being. The thoughts arising in your mind are not you, they are events in your mind, passing phenomena, as impermanent as weather, as ungovernable as clouds, and the part of you that can observe them, the awareness that notices the thought arising, notes its content, watches it pass, that part is not itself a thought. It is something quieter and more stable than any thought, something that the noise passes through but does not disturb at its deepest level. You are not the voice, you are the one who hears it, and there is an enormous, life-altering difference between those two positions. The practice that accesses this, that creates the lived, felt experience of this distinction rather than merely the intellectual understanding of it, is attention, specifically the practice of directed, non-judgmental attention to the present moment, what contemplative traditions have called meditation, and what neuroscience has now studied extensively in its effects on the default mode network, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the connectivity between the regions involved in self-referential thought and emotional regulation. The research findings are consistent and substantial. Regular practice of present moment attention measurably reduces default mode network activity. It strengthens the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, improving the brain's capacity to regulate emotional responses rather than be overwhelmed by them. It changes the relationship between the person and the thoughts arising in them, creating what researchers call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe one's own thinking from a slight but crucial distance. Not detachment, not indifference, perspective, the difference between being inside the storm and standing in a place where the storm can be seen. But the practice is not only formal meditation, it is any deliberate return of attention to the present moment, to the body, to the breath, to the sensory reality of what is actually here, rather than the narrative of what might be. The Stoic practice of the present moment, the Buddhist practice of bare attention, the simple, radical, endlessly revisitable act of noticing that you are here now, and that the thought running in the background is about somewhere else, some other time, some version of reality that has not yet arrived and may never arrive in the form the mind is constructing. And alongside this, beneath it, supporting it, is the philosophical work, the Stoic practice of identifying what is and is not in your control and releasing the energy of the former from the latter, the existentialist practice of sitting with uncertainty not as a problem to be solved but as a condition to be inhabited with courage, with honesty, with the full weight of your presence. The Buddhist practice of meeting each arising thought not with suppression or argument but with simple, clear recognition. There is a thought, it is passing, I am here. The closing. The mind that overthinks is not a broken mind. I want to say that clearly, one final time before we part. It is a sensitive mind, an intelligent mind, a mind that takes its responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously, in the way that a watch wound too tight keeps worse time than one that is wound appropriately. It is a mind that has been trying, with genuine effort and genuine care, to do the impossible work of securing the future through the application of enough present thought. It cannot do that work, not because it is insufficient, because the work itself is impossible, because the future is not a problem that thinking resolves, because certainty is not a destination that effort reaches, because the safety that the anxious mind is seeking is not something the world contains in permanent supply, and no amount of worry has ever manufactured what the world withholds. What the mind can do, what this particular, sensitive, searching mind you have is capable of, when it is not entirely consumed by the loop, is something genuinely extraordinary. It can understand. It can make meaning. It can engage with the genuine complexity of existence with a depth that quieter minds never reach, the same sensitivity that makes overthinking so exhausting is the sensitivity that makes real understanding possible. The same restlessness that drives the loop is the restlessness that has produced every genuine inquiry, every philosophical breakthrough, every honest confrontation with what it actually means to be a human being alive. In this particular world, the noise is not the enemy of the depth. It is the depth misdirected. It is the mind's finest capacity turned inward and backward instead of outward and forward, and the redirection from anxious self-referential circling to genuine, present, purposeful engagement with life is the work, the long, patient, never quite finished work of coming home to the only moment that has ever actually existed. You now know what the loop is doing and why it cannot do what it is trying to do. You know that control is the strategy that amplifies the noise rather than quieting it. You know that anxiety is not pathology. It is philosophy pressing against you, asking you to face what you would rather not face about the nature of existence and the weight of freedom. And you know that the relationship with the mind that actually works is not the relationship of the general commanding the troops. It is the relationship of the sky to the weather, spacious enough to hold everything, disturbed by nothing at its deepest level, changed by nothing that passes through. The noise inside will likely not disappear entirely. For most people with minds like yours, it does not, but it can change in character, from something that runs the show to something that runs in the background, from the loudest voice in the room to one voice among many heard, noted, not obeyed without question, from the experience of being inside the storm to the experience of watching it from a place of increasing, hard-won, quietly astonishing stillness. That stillness is not the absence of thought. It is the presence of something larger than thought, the awareness that holds it all, the you that was always there underneath the noise, waiting to be found,